I'm Michael Rickards. I'm Executive Director of the Hall Institute of Public Policy and also the host of the Hall Institute's TV Forum. Some time ago, we had the pleasure of having the late Dustan McNichol on to talk about the question of pensions in New Jersey. His presentation became an informed classic as we are looking at this issue over and over again, both in the state and in the nation. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to once again repeat that show, for much of what he said remains current wisdom. This is the Hall Institute of Public Policy's Forum, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you back. My name is Michael Rickards, and today our guest is a well-known reporter in the state of New Jersey, Dustan McNichol. Dusty, welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me over.
One of the areas that you've examined more than just about anybody is the state of pensions in New Jersey. Give us an idea of what is happening and what the history has been.
I think the idea of what is happening is you take a look at, and you want to run for cover, because they had a meeting in Trenton yesterday, Thursday, where the directors of the pension fund reported that so far this year they've lost $23 billion out of a fund that started the year worth $81 billion. So now it's worth $61 billion, and to put that in perspective, it still sounds like a big number, but the benefits it's scheduled to pay out over the next 35 years or so total $118 billion. So there's a gap to be made up. They have less than half what they need. An actuary would tell you you really need to have 80% of that amount in hand if you're going to count on investments and growth and over time to make up the difference. So they're in a box here that is a box pretty much of their own creating, and that it left them uniquely unprepared for the current financial crisis that's just driven everybody's long-term planning right off a cliff.
Is their yield a lot less than what's happening on Wall Street right about now?
No, their yield isn't a lot less. What's a lot less is, I'll keep putting this back into the terms of a 401k, because I think most people are familiar with your personal retirement account that hopefully each week as you get paid, you're putting a little bit into that. And as long as you're putting some money in, even as the stock market drops off to the tune of 23%, which it has this year, you'll see it go down, but there's a cushion in there that you've supplied by continuing to put money in. The state has not supplied that cushion, and the state has allowed local governments who are also participants in the pension system to also not supply that cushion. So for about 7 years, the only people putting money into the pension account were the employees of the state, the beneficiaries of the account. The employers didn't put in the amounts they were required. Over about the last decade, they've skipped somewhere on the order of $7 billion in contributions that they should have made. That just takes away another layer of protection for their long-term needs. And so when they hit a year like this, which is really totally unprecedented in everybody's recollections, they're just not. They don't have the wherewithal to confront it.
Now, the localities, the school boards, they're all creatures of the state legislature. They're all creatures of the state. There's no independent authorities there. Why did the state allow itself and its creatures to stop contributing to a pension system that they knew really represented a series of obligations?
The worst thing about the pension fund is that it's a very current expense to make your annual payment into the fund. And the people making that payment, the elected officials making that payment, don't see the benefit. The benefit arrives 30 years down the road when there's enough money in the fund to continue paying benefits without raising taxes. in the short term, if you're an elected official and you're looking at in the case, I'll give this year's example of the local governments that are part of the system, the town municipal governments who pay into one retirement account for traditional government employees and a separate retirement account for police and fire. The total bill that they were supposed to put in this year was $1.1 billion. So across the state, you have mayors making their budgets and looking at their piece of this $1.1 billion and saying, this is going to cost me a lot. This is becoming a large part of my budget. So, and there's no gain to them. So yesterday, the governor said that as a form of short-term tax relief, he's going to ask the legislature to pass a bill that would authorize the towns to not make half of that $1.1 billion. They would be able to postpone depositing $541 million. I mean, that works out to $1 million a town. It's not spread evenly, but in a town budget, it's a number you see. And and so they're happily embracing this. The mayors are all excited about it, but the problem is that it's not a bill that's going away. And the mechanics of how the pension fund works just make what the governor has proposed essentially the equivalent of giving the towns $541 million today by taking out a 30-year loan. And it's going to have to be repaid over the course of the next 30 years. Now, the state handles its 30-year debt a little differently, and we can get into that now, or we can get into that later because it takes a little while to explain the mechanics. But the essential problem, and the reason the pension fund is in dire straits now, is because back in the early 1990s, when the economy was doing very well and tax revenues were doing very well, the pension funds were doing very well, and the decisions were made, among them cutting the state income tax that Governor Whitman did when she was in power. They cut the state income tax, and in order to find some savings in the state budget to offset the lost revenue from that, they went to the pension fund and they said, look, we're scheduled to put in $400 million this year. If we don't put that in, that's $400 million that essentially is paying for our income tax cut. And that was really the first time that the pension system and the fund had become integrated with the state budget. And it started what has turned out to be a really bad strategy and common policy of sort of sideways glancing, including the money in the pension fund as an asset to be used in the state budget.
Why don't we stop? We'll come back to that. It's a really important issue in a moment. Thank you very much. This is Mike Rickards, and I'm back here with Dustan McNichol. You were walking us down history,
there we go.
History's lane a little bit, and I just wanted to go back. The first episode, I guess, was the decision made during the Florio administration to go from using these assets and its so-called book value to the actual value.
Yeah.
The result was it created hundreds of millions of dollars of, quote, excess revenue that nobody knew we had.
Yes, it did.
Is that bad? I mean, shouldn't we all be at a true value when we're talking about our assets?
I don't think it's a bad thing to accurately mark your assets to what they are actually worth. Where the bad part comes in is when you say, look, on paper we just had a windfall, let's spend it. And that is what happened in the Florio administration. And the Florio administration was also in a recession. They were looking for money anywhere they could find it. They have their famous selling a highway to themselves and using that money to balance the budget. They found money here by recalculating the value of the pension fund and then chopping off the part that looked like it was excess on paper and using that in the state budget. They actually can't take money out of the pension fund directly. They have to head it off before it gets to the pension fund.
So they just stopped contributions.
They stopped making their required contributions. So then we've moved into the Whitman administration, and the economy has turned around, and the pension fund is doing better. they made a series of changes that are way more technical than I understand, but it was my first exposure to seeing the pension fund used as part of the budget and to having to cover the pension fund. But they changed the way they calculate how much each employee has accrued in ultimate benefits, which lowered the amount they needed to put in each year. They and then they made a series of other changes. Stock market didn't do what they thought it was going to do, and they suddenly realized they didn't have enough money in the pension fund. So in 1997, they said that there was a $2.8 billion shortfall in the pension system. And rather than prevail on today's taxpayers to make up that difference, they were going to borrow $2.8 billion over 30 years, deposit that $2.8 billion in the pension fund, and bring it up to 100%. They did that. They barely did that. It was a vote that hardly made it through the Senate, but it eventually passed. They issued the bonds. They deposited the money. Payments to the tune of $200 million a year continue to be made on those bonds. Pension fund hit 100% funded valuation, and the legislature got approached by various unions saying, hey, there's so much money in the pension system, I think you should step up our benefits. And the way they did that is they changed the benefit calculation, the way an individual's benefits are calculated. You used to divide the number of years you worked by 60. They changed that to the number of years you worked divided by 55, which amounts to increasing your benefit by 9%. That was expensive to do for people currently working, to change the formula for people who are already enrolled in the system. That would have cost about $2.5 billion. They went a step farther and they changed it retroactively for everyone who is currently collecting a benefit. So every pension check went up by 9% overnight for hundreds of thousands of retired pension recipients. That pumped the cost of it to $5.8 billion. The legislature unfortunately approved this bill in late, it's 2000, I believe. It was the peak, proved to be the absolute peak of the stock market in the dot-com bubble era. In order to finance that $5 billion cost, they changed around the formula that estimates how much the pension fund is worth again. And instead of, you're supposed to average your stock market gains over 5 years and just use basically 20% of any 1 year's gain. They decided to stop the 5 years at the point that proved to be the peak of the stock market, declare that as the true value of the pension fund. And then, lo and behold, they had $5 billion extra to spend. They chopped it off. They used it to pay for the benefit enhancement. And the fund moved forward. The stock market collapsed. Oh, they also said, since we're fully funded, there's no reason for us to be putting our annual contributions in.
Was the investment council involved in that, or just the legislature?
No, that's strictly the legislature making those calls. The investment council is only involved in determining however much money is in the system at a given time, what areas of the market and
it'll be invested
it should be placed in. Yeah. So the end result was the stock market collapsed. The state didn't get to average the collapse out over 5 years, and they had already spent the gains they had made on paper in the stock market. So they quickly went from being 109% funded to being about 85% funded in the course of 2 years.
Did anybody warn that this was a bad stroke at that time?
Lots of people warned that this was a bad stroke. And there are the OLS put out a report to the Senate Budget Committee telling them the Office of Legislative Services. They provide background information on policy questions to the legislature.
Right.
They spelled out the downside of this. And in fact, by the time the bill got passed, the the stock market had already started to go into decline, and the OLS report pointed out that you're spending money that doesn't exist anymore. It's those paper gains are gone.
What about the Supreme Court? Now, they were involved in part of this decision?
The Supreme Court's, I don't believe they were involved in this.
Were
there was
they
a
involved
question.
In the loaning,
a question came up about whether or not the benefits that are promised to employees are a contractual right that has to be honored, or a policy issue that can be changed. But I don't think that made it to the Supreme Court.
Good. We'll come back to discussion of pensions in New Jersey. Thank you. It's Mike Rickards, and I'm back again with Dustan McNichol. Dusty, just to continue more about trying to understand where the pension system's been and where it's going, and we have plenty of time to do both. I'm sort of curious as to what happened when the bubble burst in the technology area especially.
Within the pension system, it was disastrous. They lost on the order of $14 billion over a couple of years in their investments. Within the state legislature, they took a more sheltered view of what was going on and assumed that things would rebound. Politically, it was an interesting time in the state because Governor Whitman had taken a job as Environmental Protection Commissioner with the Bush administration, which was in its infancy then, and Donald DeFrancesco, who had been Senate president under a Republican majority, became acting governor for 1 year. As the year was winding down, Donald DeFrancesco's political prospects had dimmed considerably, and he was no longer running for a full term in office, and the members of the legislature were bent on keeping a Republican majority, or the Democrats were bent on getting a majority in the legislature. As a result, the unions, who are prolific campaign contributors and phone bank operators and big supporters of their candidates of choosing, had a lot of leverage that fall. They used that leverage. They successfully prevailed on the legislature to pass these changes in the calculation of the pension and the increase in the benefits, despite what was happening in the markets. And it ended up digging the first of the holes the pension fund has found itself in. That was followed by a recovery on the stock market, and everyone's exciting books about the Dow 36,000 and fun times like that. Stock market was doing really well. Returns on the pension fund started doing well. They gradually started to drag the fund away from the accounting gimmick that had been used to pay for the benefit increase. They arrived at last year, the budget year that ended in July of 2006, I'm sorry. The pension fund finished with an investment return of 17%. Things looked like they were going great. There was money coming back in. The Governor Corzine at this point had started making contributions into the fund again for the first time. Municipal governments were increasing their level of contribution by 20% every year, so there was more coming in from that side. Employees actually started increasing another 0.5% of what they were paying into. So it looked like things might get settled down. And then obviously we arrive at this year. Pension funds peaked as the actuaries calculate how funded they are. They reached a high water mark of about 76%. Still isn't great. It's below the 80% that people are looking for, but it was looking like it was about to turn the corner and head in the right direction.
Now, the employees pay 5.5%.
It depends on the police and fire, I believe, pay 8%, and teachers and government employees pay, I think you're right, 5.5.
Is that retroactive, or is that only for new people coming in?
Oh no, it changed for everybody when they changed it. So
why did the firefighters pay so much more?
They get a lot better benefits. They can retire earlier, and they get higher benefits.
Now we're in a situation here where you see large numbers of people representing the unions, being extremely concerned about the situation, the pension fund. But yet their pensions, aren't they really entitlements rather than 401s? Why are they worried?
Oh, they're worried because at some point the debt becomes unmanageable. And at some point, no governor and no legislator and even no Supreme Court can tell a taxed public that you need to come up with the amount of money that conceivably could be asked if they keep putting off getting the fund in order. I mean, there's always the process. You know, they don't have to pay $118 billion in benefits today. They have to pay that over the next 40 years or so, however long every beneficiary is living. But it's a debt that actually exists, and they need to start addressing that debt. And the longer they forestall doing that, the bigger the debt becomes. And just as the way they manage the debt, or mismanage is the term maybe, is each year the actuaries tell them two pieces of what they owe to the pension fund. They tell them you owe a normal contribution for all the benefits that everybody who worked in the preceding year gained, and you need to cover that cost this year so that the money's in hand. And then on top of that, they have a cost to pay down the unfunded liability. The unfunded liability 2 years ago was $28 billion.
Right.
It's up it's way more than that now. And instead of paying it down at all, what the state has done every year for the last 7 or 8 at least is say, well, we're not going to pay down the unfunded liability. We're going to reset our 30-year payoff, and we'll get started on that next year.
Good. We are here with Dustan McNichol of the Star Ledger, who's probably one of the authorities on this pension question that all of us have been looking at. The Hall Institute of Public Policy has been looking at it for quite a while, in fact, for a couple of years, and we're in the process of putting together a major report. We're having a special TV session as well as a radio one to try to look at some of these issues. And we will then go in now to a second hour, which we hope that you'll get the opportunity to also watch with us, talking about the future of the pension system and what we should be concerned about. I'm Michael Rickards, representing the Hall Institute of Public Policy, saying thank you for having watched this session. Hello, this is the Hall Institute of Public Policy, and our forum today features, for the second part of our discussion, Dustan McNichol, who's the Star Ledger's expert on pensions. We spent the first episode that we had here discussing the whole question of pensions and the kind of historical travels that bring us to where we are now. And I want to discuss today, where are we going and what should we do about it? Dusty, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure.
Appreciate that. Appreciate having you. Appreciate having the expertise of one of the prime reporters in the state of New Jersey. So we're delighted for you to be with us. You've been a reporter for almost 30 years.
Yep.
That's a long time in a man's life.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And you've been in a variety of newspapers.
Yep.
And one of the things that bothers a person like me who loves newspapers is what's going on with newspapers? Why are they folding up? Or even the good ones, like the New York Times, are a little less good than they were yesterday morning.
Yeah.
What's happening?
I think the economies are working against the way newspapers are produced and delivered, that it's very expensive to put a newspaper on the paper. It's very expensive to drive that paper around your coverage area. It's very expensive to pay for the people that are handling the newspaper, and it's hard to compete against an electronic delivery system that was allowed to capture the product that was within the newspaper, the reporting, and deliver that pretty much free of charge. They didn't pay to produce the product. They don't pay very much to distribute the product. And it was something that made the newspaper model unsustainable. It's you see now with the economy in the bad shape that it's in now, and consolidations among all the big department stores and airlines, there are fewer advertisers out there. There's very few people who are advertising. You get a Circuit City declaring bankruptcy, and that's a chunk of advertising revenue. Just from the Star Ledger, my own company, they used to make, 5 years ago, they made $72 million a year from employment ads in the classified section.
Right.
And now they make $5 million a year. That's a big chunk of revenue that
everybody's
disappeared.
going on Monster.
Yes, yep. Or Craigslist and various things.
But I don't want an electronic newspaper.
Well,
I mean, I get the Washington Post that way. I look at it. I like the Washington Post.
Yeah.
But I really look forward to sitting down with the New York Times at night. I want to see the paper in my hand.
It's a different experience. I'm told that the generation coming up doesn't want to have a paper in their hand. They're just as happy to have it in the palm of their hand and read their news in a cell phone or on a BlackBerry or
but there's no
on
depth
a computer.
To it.
I think there will become they'll arrive a model that provides depth.
One of the most interesting stories has been the one that you've provided, which has been in depth in the Star Ledger about the pension problem.
I'm optimistic.
You did a very good story and on something that was terribly controversial, and I wanted to ask you about it. The BlackRock story.
Oh, right.
You, I guess, were probably the primary person that reported on the BlackRock controversy before the Investment Council.
Uh-huh.
Can you take us through that a little bit through your eyes?
Sure, and I can give you an update on that. The BlackRock, when the state found that
explain
the
what
stock
BlackRock
market,
is to explain what BlackRock is.
That BlackRock is one of many hedge funds that the state has decided to place money with in the hopes that they can keep some money out of the stock market. Essentially, their ultimate, in the back of their mind, hope is that the hedge funds will magically make more money than the stock market. But their more realistic hope is that they're going to protect some of their money from a collapse in the stock market by having some of it in these alternatives, which include hedge funds. Unfortunately, the hedge funds appear to have gotten carried away the same way that a lot of the large banks did and the investment houses. And in the case of BlackRock, the state had invested, I believe, $300 million from the pension fund last September, and in a fund that was supposed to buy up bank loans, that short-term loans banks had made to finance takeover projects by various acquisition companies. These loans apparently were selling at the then bargain rate of 90 cents on the dollar, and BlackRock thought that they could buy them up at 90 cents, and several years from now they'd be worth their full value and they'd make lots of money. Unfortunately, the credit crisis got worse, not better. By about a month and a half ago, those loans were only trading at 70 cents on the dollar, and BlackRock had borrowed $1 for or $2 for every dollar that they actually had to buy these instruments. And some of those loans were coming, the people on the other side of those loans said, you need to have more value behind it. You need cash to guarantee that you're going to pay us sometime. And so BlackRock had to go back to the original investors, including the state of New Jersey, and said, we need everybody to put another 1/3 in so that we can avoid having to sell off some of these things at a loss to raise the cash that our creditors are demanding. The state went ahead and did that. Then in the November Investment Council meeting, 2 more hedge funds who were engaged in the same kind of business came before the Investment Council. And,
which were those?
One is called Canyon Rock, I believe, and I can't remember the other one offhand, but it was the exact same mechanism. They were in the same bind. That market didn't play out.
So what they're doing is they're saying we initially thought we could buy more on the margin.
and it would all gain in
and
value.
it would all gain, and it didn't.
And now the people on the other end of those margins are saying, you need
We
more
want to
collateral.
see the cash.
Yeah.
Let's break for a minute. We'll come back and pick this up.
Okay.
Dustan McNichol, you were talking a little bit about the movement of assets into the hands of various investor groups. In the past, they used to simply be run by the investment council staff, investing money. Now you're talking about money that's going into professional investment houses, hedge funds, and whatever.
And the staff of the investment council actually did an amazing job when you think about it. There was a statistic put forth by the head of the investment division in November. He said that each of the employees in the investment council is responsible for managing $4.5 billion in assets, which is it'd be hard to sleep at night these days if you had that on your hands. So part of what the state was trying to do was to get some more expertise in there, to get into areas that, and one individual with $4.5 billion wouldn't have the ability to size up adequately. And so they basically outsourced that.
And their
specialty.
salaries are nowhere near what people make who do direct those types of resources.
No, they're not getting the big bonuses you read about in the paper,
or even a
anything
percentage
like
of
that.
what
they're getting
what other big pension systems get.
No, they had to pass special legislation to let the director of the Division of Investments get paid. I think it's about $240,000.
Yeah.
So yes, their salaries are not. They're more than you make at McDonald's, but they're a lot less than you make at Goldman Sachs.
Comparable pension, not Wall Street, but the comparable pension funds.
I'm unfamiliar with the other
California,
state pension
New York,
funds.
Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the way they came more into line with those high-profile pension funds, like the California pensions funds, are the biggest public fund on earth, and they are very active in terms of imposing their social priorities on the companies they invest in, because they're a gorilla out there. They have a lot of sway. They also are very prolific users of private money managers and investment funds. So it's not unusual that New Jersey would have started. New Jersey was really one of the only major public funds that didn't use outside managers. And even today, they don't use them to as much and as an extent as a lot of the larger companies. Their problem is they started using them at a time when, to outside appearances, it looked like they're looking for some magic bullet to try and beef up the fund.
Increase their
and they insist that's not the case. They say, no, it's just a lowering of risk and spreading diversification into areas we don't have expertise. But it's hard to get away from the notion that they were hoping that this was going to bail them out.
Was the Lehman Brothers investment one of the first where they went to these managers?
No, Lehman Brothers actually was an in-house decision. That was one made by the investment division itself. Their thinking at the time, which was back in June, was Lehman Brothers is hitting a rough patch. Lehman Brothers has been a company for decades. We know how they work. We like the managers. We like their style. This is going to make us a lot of money.
So they invested in the stock, not as managers.
Right. And then obviously the company went bankrupt and then the stock became worthless. So they lost $115 million. There's a lot of questions about that now. The head of the Division of Investment says the questions are not fair. It was a bad call. They wish it had gone otherwise, and it didn't. Now I think there's going to continue to be a lot of questions. They're going to get second-guessed a lot more than they ever did.
Because of the general decline of the market that's affected all of us.
And because by not putting contributions in, the state basically as a policy was relying on the market performance of the funds to carry the load. And as a policy, that has proven to be a disaster. So everyone is now questioning, well, who's deciding where who's putting us in the market? Yes, at the November meeting, one of the newest members on the investment council, which basically is an umbrella oversight board that says, yes, we want to put this much in alternative investments, and yes, we want to put this much in real estate, and yes, we want this much in stocks, but they don't say we want this much in Sears stock and this much in Home Depot. That's up to the division. Anyway, the newest member is a former Communications Workers of America local president. CWA is the largest state workers union. They've been opposed to the whole use of outside managers from the get-go. Their concern was that the state loses the ability to head off disasters, and it's going to become politically motivated. So
But if you don't use outside managers, and the average person, as you said, has to really invest over $4 billion, unless you're simply indexing, and following the prescribed benchmarks, how can you not use outside people?
Well, and there's an argument to be made that why not just index? That this is a big pot of money. Statistically, it's probably going to go up and go down pretty much in tandem with the overall market anyway. So is it worth getting into all these controversies?
There's a whole academic literature. There's a whole academic literature that shows that essentially the yield is pretty much the same in the long run.
Yeah.
If you had simply gone with the market, gone with the indexing, than if you hired people to play. And
and that's a policy decision. It's a policy decision.
But shouldn't you have if you're really running? I mean, at one time the pension system hit $86 billion. When $86 billion was $86 billion.
Yeah.
How can you possibly manage that with a small staff that's underpaid? Don't you have to go?
Then you're pretty much hoping that you find the good stocks at the right time, and
we
put a big chunk of money in them.
We all do. We'll come back to that in our conclusion. I'm back here with Dustan McNichol of the Star Ledger, the outstanding expert on pensions in New Jersey, for those of us that are really interested in it. As I mentioned to you in the previous comment, the Hall Institute is coming out with a policy statement dealing with the pension system in New Jersey, and we've been, for the last 3 years, had on our website a whole series of articles showing the difficulties, not just in New Jersey, but throughout the country. As we become older and as we really haven't kept an eye on where our assets are. I'm a new governor, and I'm sitting down in Trenton, and I say, my gosh, this guy McNichol here McNichol really looks like he knows what he's talking about. And I'm going to invite him in and ask him, what do I do knowing the situation that I have?
Well,
what do you advise?
Our current governor, Governor Corzine, is fond of saying when you're in a hole, the first thing you want to do is stop digging. Pension fund is in a big hole, and unfortunately, the governor tossed another shovel down to the mayors there in November when he offered them the opportunity to stop making half their payments this year.
Are they ever going to have to pay that back?
Yeah, in theory they will. I wouldn't, but that's the first step, is to recognize that it's a bitter pill, and it's not a priority that anybody really wants to see in the state budget, except members of the pension system, the unionized members who have their benefits reliant on that fund. But you got to stop shortchanging the fund before you can ever hope that it's going to get back in balance. I think that's the hardest step, and that's the first step. And really, it's been more than a decade since anyone has taken that step, and until somebody does, it's just going to get bigger and bigger. And then the alternative is you can let the debt get bigger and bigger and bigger, so that instead of having a required annual contribution of $2 billion, which the state had this year, your required annual contribution will be $4 billion or $8 billion. And eventually governor will say it's unrealistic to put money in, to dedicate that much money to a pension system. We've got to tell people that the benefits just aren't going to be paid. We've got to adjust the payout.
Can you adjust benefits for those people that are collecting? Is that legal?
There is a opinion from the Office of Legislative Services again that says that anyone who has been an employee for 5 years enrolled in the pension system is by law requires entitled to the benefits at the levels that they're in place when they hit that 5 years. That would be one of the first things that would have to change before you could go about a wholesale change and revocation of benefits. But I think at some point, and it's not a point that's a mile away at this point. I mean, I think you're talking a number of years. You're probably talking a decade or more. But it's a point that's out there that someone is going to have to seriously say there's an unsustainable level of benefits promised, and we've got to change the promise. Just to put that in black and white, there was when the pension fund peaked at $86 billion, the annual pension benefits, they paid out $3 billion a year. Today, it's down at $57 billion, and every year they pay out about $5.4 billion a year. So the annual cost of what that fund has to support goes up by a sizable amount every year.
How much of that is the fact that people are allowed to have medical coverage for the rest of their lives?
That's a whole separate thing. That's a different
is that cost
$50 billion. No.
So that's not included?
No, that's nowhere in there. They pay that. They pay annually the actual dollar amount of the premiums that come due.
Okay.
And that's another $2 billion a year. And if they want to get ahead of that, the actuary said they would have to put in an additional, I think it was $4 billion this year, some astronomical amount. So yes, that's a topic for a different show.
If I'm a union leader, what argument could people make that I really should go before my people and tell them that they should cut benefits that they think they had?
If I'm a union leader, I can't make that argument. I mean, I'm a union leader who signed contracts and made concessions and agreed to give up Lincoln's birthday as a holiday in return for having these benefits preserved in that contract. You can't make that argument as a union
What do you
leader.
tell taxpayers who are complaining they're already heavily taxed and have the highest property tax in the Republic? What do you tell them about the idea that they...
I don't have anything good to tell them either. I'm like the union leader. I'm saying it all comes down to a lot of opportunities for political will that the political will wasn't there to do what would have been an uncomfortable, expensive proposition several years ago. Instead, side detours were taken to avoid that pain, and as a result, the pain gets worse and worse. And it's
do you think that the media that you've spent your life with has really focused on this issue as much as they should have?
I think over the past 2 or 3 years they have. When I first went to the first meeting of the State Investment Council that I attended, it was back in the first year that Jim McGreevey was governor. So what's that, 2002? They didn't know what to do with me. They met in a nice lodge in Princeton, and they didn't know what this reporter was doing here, and they had to call the Attorney General's office to find if they were a public body and this and that. Now you get New Jersey Network and ABC and a lot of people covering the investment council. So we've arrived at the accident scene.
So you're basically giving us a prescription for tough love.
Yes, I am.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to really talk with Dustan McNichol of the Star Ledger, who is, as I said, one of the outstanding experts on our pension problems. The Hall Institute is glad to be a part of the forum to present you to the people, but also we're glad to be able to contribute our own public policy report. It's not an issue that's going to be solved, as you've said, overnight, and it's not an issue that's going to be illuminated by one report. But hopefully both of us will be doing our part to enlighten the people of New Jersey, and in the process, certainly I have found, enlighten ourselves. Dusty, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Rickards from the Hall Institute, and I want to thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you'll watch both of our shows dealing with this extremely important issue. Goodbye.